Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments across the southern parts of the Donetsk region, where the Russians have managed to advance southwest of Pokrosk and east of the city, while the Ukrainians managed to advance in the direction of Tetsk directly head on from the northwest. The Russians also managed to make some advances within the Sumy region in the northern section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to get closer to the fortified positions here northeast of Zelenopole. We can see that the Russians are working their way up northwest of Novosylka, where their objective is to flank the fortified positions from their rear, gain control over the northern fortified position, and allow the Russians to flank the southern ones from their most advantageous position, allowing them to move onwards towards the town itself. The Russians would also look to flank the town from the rear and cut it off from its supply lines into the Zaporizhia region. The Russians are here looking to gain control over both of these towns along the border area as they continue gaining full control over the Donetsk region. Moving further north, the Russians managed to gain control of about half of Bahhatier as well as the fortified positions south of the town. The Russians launched assaults with infantry groups to gain control over the forest lines here to the south of the town. They launched an armored assault towards the fortified positions and continued that infantry assault within the town itself, cutting it off from the town of Mykhailivka just north of the town. The Russians also managed to gain control of the fortified position, which allowed them to cut off the main supply route in and out of Bahhatier, meaning that the remaining Ukrainian forces are operationally encircled within the town. The Russians will look to gain control over the road now, which will allow them for additional supply lines into Bahhatier, following which offensive operations will move onwards beyond that of Bahhatier towards Otradne along the main highway, and from the south towards Otradne and Kumar. The Russians also started offensive operations inside of Oleksivka, gaining control over the first two streets within the eastern parts of the town. The Russians will continue offensive operations towards the fortified positions and to gain control over the town itself with a combined assault from the town of Bahhatier once the Russians finish securing it, and with flanking maneuvers from the north following the capture of the forest lines in the area. The Russians will look to gain full control over Oleksivka and move along the main highway towards the Dashne at the end of it. For this, the Russians would likely look to cut off the highway as well, or at least threaten the supply lines of the Ukrainians to divert their resources and commence a encirclement of the Ukrainian positions in the area. The Russians continued offensive operations, gain control over the last fortified position here south of Mykhailivka, where the objective is to gain control over both towns. Gain control over the fortified position south of the town allows them to, with the front line aligned with the town, to start operations to gain a foothold within them and start to gain control over both Mykhailivka and Myrolyubivka before moving on to the final fortified position along the border area. The Russians have control over the road between Kotlярivka and Mykhailivka, where they can supply their forces through Nadiivka to the east, onwards towards Kotlярivka and upwards along the main road here south of Mykhailivka. There's also the connection between Novolexandrivka and Mykhailivka, which also connects with the road here to the south of Mykhailivka, where the Russians can launch offensive operations along both of these roads from two separate supply lines. It's not important that the roads connect closer towards the town. The main advantage the Russians gain by having both of these supply lines means that the Ukrainians have to cover both the road from Nadiivka up towards Mykhailivka, as well as the road from Novolexandrivka towards Mykhailivka. Those are two separate roads all the way to the entrance of the town. That means one minefield can stop the Russian offensive, but they need two sets of FPV drones that operate in each of these roads. Russians can launch a simultaneous attack. If the first attack is successful, the second one can even divert their offensive operation towards Myrolyubivka as well, or towards the western parts of the town. This means that the Russians will have more flexibility with additional supply routes in and out of these towns. To the east of Pokrosk, the Russians made several advances here as well. The Russians managed to gain control over the majority of Myrolyubivka as well as Mykhailivka, both across the Kasany-Terets River and the eastern and western banks of it. Russians also gained control over the fortified position here south of Mykhailivka, and they are fighting over the northern outskirts of both Mykhailivka and Myrolyubivka. The Russians with these offensive operations are securing both banks of the river line here south of Mykhailivka. Their objective is to flank the fortified positions and encircle them with a combined assault from Malynivka in the north and Myrolyubivka from the south, where the Russians have not just gained full control over the majority of Myrolyubivka and Mykhailivka, but they also gained control over the majority of Malynivka. We see with both this geolocated footage in the northern parts of the town and this geolocated footage in the southern parts of the town that the Russians managed to reach the western outskirts of it, at the outskirts of Myrne, and the fortified positions here southwest of Malynivka. Russians launched assaults both through the main highway to the south and to gain control over the entire town in the north, to reach the western parts of it and the outskirts of the fortified positions. The Russians are also fighting over the southern outskirts of these fortified positions, but with control over Myrolyubivka, the Russians can launch offensive operations along the roads here to the north of the town to connect with the Russian forces near Malynivka in the direction of Myrne, where the road intersects. This will allow them to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces along these fortified positions, as well as launching offensive operation along the second road to the rear of these fortified positions, storming it directly head-on from an advantageous position at the weak point of these fortified positions. Gaining control over this section of the front line with Myrolyubivka as the southwestern anchor and Malynivka as the northern anchor will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations towards Mykhailivka and Myrne, getting control over both of which will open the road for the Russians to gain control over the defensive lines further north, flanking them from the rear as well, and then start fighting over the towns isolated from the defensive lines, getting control over which will allow the Russians to continue their offensive operations on a wider front along the main highway to isolate Pokrosk from Konstantinivka and to secure the operational encirclement of the city. The Russians will here look to establish FPV drone positions and forward artillery positions to bombard the next defensive line of the Ukrainians as well. As long as they're able to establish forward positions in the highway direction, they'll be able to launch heavy attacks on the next defensive lines. Over a long period of time will allow the Russians to then break through this defensive line. This can happen simultaneous with the siege of both Pokrosk and Konstantinivka, and this is why the Russians will look to gain control over the highway on a wider front, to gain control over towns such as Mykhailivka, Roskishne, Dovabelka, not just for the operational encirclement of Konstantinivka, but also to threaten the next defensive line here in the western parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to advance north of Malynivka, where they managed to gain control over some fortified positions here along the main highway as they continued offensive operations along the residential area north of Malynivka. Russians are slowly moving onwards towards the rear of Yablonivka. There's also a likelihood that the Russians will continue fighting over the fortified positions here to the northwest to secure the western flank of the main highway and for future offensive operations towards Povyar, Poltavka and Rusinyar here to the northwest. Combined with the assaults coming from the south, the Russians will launch several offensive operations simultaneously to expand the zone of control along the highway. These are areas that will cover a lot of square kilometers, yet they are not very heavily fortified or heavily urbanized, which means that there will likely be a lot of infantry groups that will move along the forest lines. This means there will not be a lot of casualties on the Russian side. There's not a lot of equipment that will be used either, but it will take a lot of time. As we can see here to the southwest of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have to capture one fortified position after another, slowly capturing the forest lines, and over a period of a week, it takes them from Novoalexandrivka to Novomykhailivka. That is a short distance, however, they are looking to avoid as many casualties as possible. Until they reach the outskirts of the town, they use largely infantry groupings until they have to face the fortified positions, where they then use armored groups to reach these fortified positions, fight over them and capture them, and then the infantry moves onwards on their own. That is the sort of tactics the Russians are using. In the eastern section, the Russians continue being pushed back from the western outskirts of Tetsk. The Ukrainians are almost regaining full control over the fortified positions as they move into the outskirts of the Tetsk city. We see that the Ukrainians still hold their positions in the northern and southern flank of Tetsk, where the Russians no longer have the threat of encirclement. However, with the control over the forest patch to the north, the Russians can launch flanking maneuvers towards these fortified positions and the Ukrainian forward positions within the city. The Russians may look to restart offensive operations here on the western outskirts of Tetsk, where they look to regain control over the industrial area and encircle the Ukrainian forces. However, they need to secure and stabilize the front line first. The Ukrainians are currently on the offensive here west of Tetsk, and that is as a result of them regaining control over the industrial zone and still holding on to some of these fortified positions and high grounds along the waste heaps in the northern parts of the city. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians managed to make 2 advances, both in the direction of the town of Vodilehi, as well as gaining full control over Bilovody, here further south of the town. The Russians continued the establishment of the buffer zone across the Kursk region into the Sumy region, where they're looking to gain control over some of these towns along the border area on a wider front, creating a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian border for no additional Ukrainian offensives into the Suchet direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.